Everybody, welcome to the 10th episode of the Futureworlds Metaverse podcast. Today, we are blessed to have Elijah Kim as our special guest. Elijah was at our Futureworlds conference about a week and a half ago in LA, and he's been a friend for quite a while. He's got a very illustrious background, which I'm sure he'll tell us about. So let's just hop right in. Elijah, welcome to the Futureworlds podcast.
Thanks for having us, Steve. It's great to be here.
Of course, of course. So I remember you from Universal Music Days when you were out here in Santa Monica working with the record guys. So tell me how that came about, or if you got story before that I don't know about, you could jump
Yeah,
into that
no,
as well.
so I mean, great memory and good times. That was well over almost, kind of want to say 15 years ago, I guess, when we first met. But yeah, I started working with Universal Music Group, actually starting right around 2000. But as a college lifestyle marketing rep, I was doing some work with Interscope Records, pretty analog, like, putting posters up on, telephone poles and things like that, throwing out stickers and things, right? But I got connected with the New Media Group, which it's funny that that's what they were called, New Media, right?
Still new media.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And so, it was sort of like the ragtag kind of nerdy crew that was basically, known for building the websites, right? But very quickly, that group became more important because more fans were interacting with the bands through these websites, but also through the then social media, juggernauts at the time, MySpace, right?
Sure.
Even Friendster.
Friendster.
Yeah. And so, this is definitely kind of that Web 1, Web 2 kind of sort of transition. And it was a really fun time where I, unbeknownst to me, would become sort of a leader in their digital practice. Initially, I thought, like many working in the music industry, they wanted to work with the artist. They wanted to be on the creative side. I didn't really think I'd be on this kind of corporate digital strategy side of things. In fact, I kind of thought I'd use that as a wedge to get into the fun, cool parts, like the parts you were in, Steve, right? I was like,
Yeah.
like, oh, you get to work with the artist, cool. But I learned later, and as you know, it's like you don't get a job as an artist manager or as an A&R person. You get to know that artist and you develop them, and then you bring them to a label, and then you kind of slot into an A&R role, right? Whereas I thought, like, oh, I could just kind of apply for an A&R gig, right? Nope, that's not the case. So I cut my teeth kind of doing the corporate thing for a while. But certainly always had an affinity and passion for working closer to the artist. But while I was at UMG, formally between 2005 and 2010, it was a really transformative period for the music industry where, CD sales were falling off a cliff, right? And I had drank the Kool-Aid. I was like, hey, what can we do to protect this? What do we do to slow down, all this piracy, right? And I was on these anti-piracy calls, and we were like literally playing whack-a-mole with all these different P2P networks like BitTorrent, Pirate Bay, LimeWire, you name it, right? And just before I formally joined, UMG just won a major lawsuit against Napster, and they thought that the music the party was going to continue, the music was going to keep playing. But the reality is, like I said, it was like whack-a-mole. So kill Napster, and then sprouts up, Pirate Bay, or boom, kill that, and then LimeWire, kill that, and then something else. Then what happened was YouTube came out, and this was around 2005. And I still remember, I was very fortunate. I originated and sourced our opportunity with YouTube, where I came across it, and I was like, what is this? Because I was tasked to kind of literally search and destroy for any like video streaming platforms that were not MTV or Yahoo Launch, if you remember Yahoo Launch, right?
Sure.
And then so I was constantly finding these startups, these emerging kind of streaming platforms, and I would have to be the bearer of bad news and be like, hey, look, cease and desist. You've got our whole music catalog here. You better take it down or else, right? And it was like, I can't recall. I think it was like $125,000 per copyright violation.
150.
Or 150, that's right. Yeah, yeah. And so it was like, I'd quickly do the math for them and be like, look, you've got like, 30 songs right on your homepage right now. Let's do the math. It's like you're toast, right? And I got to be honest, like at the time, like, I drank the Kool-Aid and I didn't have quite an understanding or respect for the entrepreneurship on the other side. I was just there doing my job, right? But then I got to really understand like what they were advancing for, technology and quite frankly, humankind, right? It's like access to music and then I started to really appreciate and quite frankly honor what they were trying to do. And then I started to work with them and I was like their Sherpa into this ivory tower, right, and trying to convince the senior management and leadership to enable these companies and platforms, and trying to convince them that it was actually good for the industry and it would actually advance us. But
How long did it take you to come to that realization? Because you're still at Universal, right? So you're the man sending cease and desists,
yeah,
and then at some point you flip over and go, maybe we should partner. Was that like a week, a month, a year? How long does that take?
No, it took a little while. I mean, it was like just because I would get to know these entrepreneurs. Like I literally would meet the CEOs and founders of a lot of these top streaming platforms. And as I got to know them, they were the ones that convinced me, right? So I'll never forget, like I was early days, there was another platform called iMeme, IMEEM.
Yeah.
And Steve Jang was the CMO of iMeme. And I got to know him. And Steve, with a lot of kind of things in common, both Korean American, both spent time in LA, both worked in the music industry. Well, I was current music industry. He was former EMI and at Capitol. And so he understood the record label system. And we would have these really deep conversations about streaming and access to music and how to compensate the artist. And by the way, at the time, music videos were still treated as a promotional tool, right?
Sure.
They were not being really monetized and they weren't being created for monetization. They were being created to raise awareness for the band, right?
Sure.
But UMG, without many people realizing, they took a really aggressive step into monetizing that product, and so a lot of the video streaming platforms, they believed that they were helping the artists and they were helping to promote them, and they were, right? But they didn't
Absolutely.
know that the industry was changing its tune and wanting to monetize that. And quite frankly, they were needing to monetize it because no one was paying for music anymore,
They were
right?
in trouble after Napster for sure.
Yeah. And then so, selling a 99-cent download on iTunes was very, very challenging still. There was a moment, where people were paying for ringtones and that helped for a little while, right?
Yep.
But this is where it was really fascinating to kind of just be right there in the belly of the beast and seeing all this stuff going on and a lot of swirl, and I honestly felt like bipolar. I was, one day I was like against, I was the man against the little guy, and then the next day I was like, the man trying to help the little guy, right? And
You're
then the
Lars
little guy,
Ulrich.
yeah, yeah. But it was interesting because the little guy quickly became the big guy, right?
Yep.
It's like I'll never forget. It was 2005. I was doing presentations on sharing what user generated content was, and the execs were confused. They're like, UGC, like what the hell is this? And then they were like, we just finished the fight, the P2P fight, and they're tired from that. And they're like, you're telling me we got to get into another dogfight on this UGC topic? And they didn't realize how big it could get so fast. And
This
so
is
they
pre
decided,
YouTube, right? 2005.
yeah,
That's pre
yeah,
YouTube.
super early. Yep. And this is where they quickly would dismiss a lot of these UGC players as like not a big threat or deal. They were like, yeah, a little ankle bite, no big deal. It's not Napster, right? Little did they know, right? And then so
Yeah.
these things just kind of snowballed into behemoths so quickly. And actually, funny enough, I think Lou Kerner, right?
Sure.
So Lou actually cut his teeth. Lou is a early UGC pioneer. In
Oh yeah.
fact, so not many people know this. Before Lou was Crypto Oracle Lou was, .tv Lou. He stood up .tv out of Idea Lab. And then subsequent to that, he started Bolt, which was earlier than YouTube, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was like 2004 video streaming platform.
Yep.
One of the big mistakes I think that Bolt made, unlike YouTube, is they actually paid the piper and they did a deal with the record labels, and that basically flipped them upside down, and they couldn't afford to pay the per play royalty, and they were basically toast. Whereas YouTube, they basically just kind of,
Cheated the whole way.
yeah, or they just kind of stayed under the radar just long enough, and then they discreetly ballooned up into the biggest video streaming platform that exists, right? But it was interesting because at the time, as I mentioned, it was not noticed, and no one cared. And I'll never forget, it was like I was like the low man on the pole, but I was like it was like a inverted triangle. It was like, this huge layer of executives, and then there was like me on the bottom. And so I had like a dozen bosses. Yeah. And then but one of my boss's bosses, she basically calls me in my office, and she's like, Elijah, I need you to come over. And I was like, okay. So I walked down the hall, sit in her office. She's like, what's this UUC thing again? And I was like, UGC. She's like, yeah, explain it to me quickly. And I was like, user generated content. Kids are uploading, for the most part, like, videos of them, doing stupid human tricks, farting into a cup or whatever, no big deal. But a lot of these kids are also uploading our music or syncing these videos with our music. Yep. And in many cases, they're actually just uploading our music videos, right? And she's like, okay. And she's like, and now give me an update again on this YouTube company that you've been talking to. I was like, yeah, well, they're one of the biggest culprits, right? They've got, all our music, and I started even curating and building our own YouTube Universal Music Group page at the time.
Oh, great.
and I was like, yeah, and we're already number one. We're the number one channel, the most subscribed channel right now. And she's like, shit. And I was like, what? And I had been serving these cease and desist notices and whatnot, these DMCA takedown notices. And she's like, well, they just scooped up two of my friends. There was a guy named Chris Maxey and Zahava Levine, and they were at Real Networks at the time, right? Oh, yeah. And Real Networks, they had Rhapsody, and Rhapsody, prior to Napster, prior to Spotify, they were the big dog for streaming. Yep. And so you had these two executives leave, their senior roles as general counsel and I think COO, to go join YouTube. And she was like, why would they go to this little startup? And I was like, well, because it's not little, it's actually big. And like, you could just sense that something massive was about to happen. And then so she's like, okay, well, we're going to have a meeting with them tomorrow. They're flying down. And, so like, you're going to help lead it because it the best. And so I was like, okay. So the YouTube team came down, and we're sitting down with them and discussing a potential deal. And I launch in, and I'm leading the conversation. And my boss's boss basically gives me this look, and she's like, shit, this thing is pretty big. And she basically whispers, she's like, hey, I hate to do this to you, but I'm going to take it over from here. And I was like, go, by all means. I mean, you're the top dog. So she leads the conversation and very eloquently communicates why we're entitled to, what we felt entitled to at the time. Short story long is UMG, not many people know this, but UMG actually owned 1% of YouTube. And
never heard that.
Yeah, nobody knows this. Maybe people aren't supposed to know this, but
too late.
Yeah, so maybe not UMG. Large company may have owned a piece of video streaming platform, but they immediately converted that stock, that equity, into cash as soon as this other large technology company acquired it for over
Google.
Yeah. So, but it was a really incredible experience where I just saw this company go from zero to hero. And what I also saw was, it's like, these guys are brilliant, but what they're doing isn't, I mean, it was innovative, but, I was like, wow, like I feel like I could do that. Right. And then I was like, I knew a lot of technologists, and I went to Berkeley. So a lot of my old classmates were in tech or going into tech. And I was just like, man, I really want to be on that side of the table. And that's also where, subsequent to that deal, I really became very proactive and active with trying to advocate and work with the startups. And, and also I kind of developed and established sort of a kind of a reputation for being like the head of digital at UMG, which was not the case. I was just the person that was leading all the emerging tech deals. Because while I was dealing with Silicon Valley startups, my bosses were dealing with MTV, MSN Video, Yahoo Launch. Like those were the big dogs at the time. And then now, nope, none of those really exist anymore, right?
You were just the guy from Menlo Park.
Yeah, right.
You kind of just glossed over this. So why would UMG buy into YouTube And is that a settlement? Was that like, hey guys, we're sorry that whatever, but we'll just let you buy in? But why? What's the impetus if they seem like they were, you know, infringing on your rights? All of a sudden, it goes from an infringer to an investor, right? Why did that happen?
Yeah. So I hate to say this and admit to this, but there were a lot of shakedown deals. There were a lot of deals where it was like, hey, you want to, it's like, pay the piper, right? So it's like,
Yeah,
you want to do business with us? And UMG then and to this day still owns, the lion's share of the market, right?
sure.
And so at the time, UMG owned like 30+% of the global music, kind of catalog, and even greater on the Latin side. I think it's like 50% of all the Latin music at the time was UMG. So anyhow, if you wanted to have a viable streaming platform that had music, you needed to work with UMG.
Of
And
course.
UMG knew this, right? And UMG basically was like, the position at the time was they're sick and tired of having companies build, massive fortunes and huge businesses on their backs. And
Sure.
they were like, we want to participate equitably in this. And so therefore they felt that they were entitled. The content was such a critical and integral part of the business that they felt entitled to equity without even paying for it. They were like, hey, you're gonna give us a piece of your company, right? But how some of these deals were structured, though, it was like, well, we'll pay in fees, like the until you recoup the many millions of streams, like we'll that will be rolled in as an investment. That was kind of in some cases that's how it would play out. In other cases, it was just straight up a shakedown. It's like, hey, give me 10% of your company just to have a seat at the table, right?
Well, look at
So
what happened with Spotify, right? The big three owned a third of Spotify up until a few years ago. I
yeah,
think Warner's, or the other two divested, but I think Warner stayed in, but same thing. And I always wondered, why doesn't Spotify have deeper data? Because even at the label level, you can't get granular data from the DSPs. And I thought they know exactly what device played that song and where and when, but
yep,
they're not sharing it with anybody. They give you a heat map. It says, hey, you got 22 million streams in the Northeast. That's not really granular data. They
yeah,
know. And if I were one of the big three, I'd say, hey, we're not going to license you anything unless you give us the data. We don't
yeah.
mind that you make a profit on our backs. We'll share that with you, but we also want to share in the actual consumer data, which they've never done. I don't know why. And then, like you said, they divested. So interesting play back there. That's the back of room stuff that no one ever talks about is
Yeah.
that
No,
those
it's
deals,
crazy. It's
and no one knows those deals, right? Except Elijah Kim, ladies and
Oh,
gentlemen.
hardly. No, no, no. In fact, it's like this is such dated, sort
Oh
of
yeah,
dusty knowledge and information. I mean, literally, like this is mid 2000s, but this is also it was special because there were not a lot of people in the room then. It
right.
was still small. Everyone knew each other, right? And so, it was a privilege and truly an honor to kind of have been able to participate and take part in playing a role in shaping what the music industry is today.
Who was your boss's boss? Who was the level that can make a decision at that point?
Oh
Do you,
boy. Okay. Well, so I guess I can give them some shout outs. So
oh, okay.
our crew, it was a very special crew. So our crew, it was called E-Labs at the time. So like electronic labs. And at the time, Larry Kenswell was the president of E-Labs. And Larry, longtime industry veteran, he was running MCA Records for a while. But along with Larry Kenswell, there was David Ring. David Ring was also MCA alumni. And then Amanda Marks, she was Mercury Records GM, and also ran Doug and Jimmy's Farm Club, if you remember
Sure.
Farm Club.
Remember that? Yeah.
And then Amanda's now at Apple. There was also Jeff Bronikowski. He's now at Apple as well.
I know Jeff well. Yes.
Yep. And then, and then Rio Cariff, who's now at Sing. So shout out to Rio and the Sing speaker. Get one of those. It's amazing. So Rio was basically the head of digital, and we stood up Vivo actually outside within UMG. So that's another thing. People are not, many people aren't unaware of this, but we incubated Vivo within UMG. We created Vivo within our group. So we were kind of like, unbeknownst to us, we're the founding team of a video streaming platform,
And didn't that get bought into by the other two major label groups at some point as well, or was it always UMG?
Yeah, no, it was a joint venture between Sony BMG, UMG. Warner wasn't in the deal at the time. It was mostly Sony BMG and UMG and Google at the time.
Okay.
And then, but we raised capital from outside. I think the Abu Dhabi Media Investment Group like put quite a bit of capital to stand it up. And then Rio left to be the CEO of Vivo for a while, and then he left Vivo to be the chief content officer at Magic Leap. And then now he's at Sing. But Rio is incredible. And, it was a very transformative time. And, like I learned a lot, and, it was really special to learn from some of the best. And, and it was a cool band. It was like, and there's still quite a lot of, so the UMG alumni out of eLabs, they're onto some pretty incredible major things. And then there's still quite a few that are still at the label. And I stay in touch with them.
Do you remember Jeremy Welt?
I didn't really work closely with him, but he was on, I think if I remember correctly, he was at Interscope, right?
He was at Warner.
Warner, okay.
And he was the first guy that I met on any kind of digital strategy or digital anything at any label. And I had him on the podcast, I don't know, a month ago. And he reminded me that I hired him to come over and wire my office. Cause he's like, yeah, you were like the first management company I ever put in like, a LAN in their office. He goes, no one did that. And this was like, mid 90s. And, but I just remember him as being same kind of story, bottom of the totem pole, huge access to stuff that became, super big. And early days, because there's a handful of people that were at each label that were running the stuff that no one knew what they were doing. It was all pioneering time. And then, he went up through Walmart, did a bunch of brand stuff, but it's interesting to hear that you had this very, very similar story and similar path. So, all right, how did that go into startups, and how did you get moving into that space?
Yeah, I mean, so it was in startups, right? I just was on the other side of the table, or maybe the wrong side of the table. But it was also kind of another funny story is like when I worked there, they had, and the office is still there, but they had this kind of interesting parking structure where it was like P1, P2, P3. P1 is where all the senior management would park, and then also like the artists that came to visit. And then P2 was, like the, management, directors, VPs and whatnot. And then P3 was like everyone else, right? And so like
I remember that parking structure.
Yeah, right.
Right there off Colorado. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but it was always kind of like this, an interesting drive down to P3, because I would watch, like the cars progressively get kind of, like
the Porsches and the Mercedes and all of a sudden down to like the Priuses. Yeah.
So, but it was like, you'd literally see like Lambos and Ferraris and, like those were typically the artists, not the exec. The execs were all driving Porsches and Mercedes and whatnot, but so you'd see the artist cars parked up there, like nice supercars or whatever. And then even actually Rio did have a Aston Martin, which is pretty cool. But otherwise, then you get down to that P2, which is like BMWs and Mercedes, and then P3, that's where like the Hondas and the Toyotas were, and that's where I was parked, right? But it just kind of like dawned on me. I was like, wow, it will take me forever to get to P1, right? Because I was like, I look at these guys, I'm sitting in these rooms and I'm hearing their stories, and it took literally like many years for them to get to where they are. And I was, hyper, and I just wanted, fast results, and,
and the Ferrari, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I was young. And so I was like, fuck this, I'm going to go on the other side of the table. Right. And I'm seeing these startups just kind of go from zero to hero. And I was like, and I started like actually hinting to a lot of the startups that were coming in. I would kind of be like, hey, what kind of gaps do you guys got over there? Maybe I can, come over on that side. Right. Sure. And actually I did get a couple offers, to come over, but they just weren't the right fit. It wasn't, quite exciting or interesting to me, but nonetheless, I was like always kind of thinking like the next YouTube that comes in, I will join them, and then, there was kind of an opportunity to maybe join Spotify early, but nonetheless, like it was a thought and a fascination and rather fantasy that, I had while I was at UMG. And then finally, 2010, I left the label, And I actually did something not in tech, but I had an opportunity to take over a fashion company here in LA.
Ooh,
A designer named Louis Verdad. He's still designing, and quite honestly, he actually does quite a bit in the music business. So he designs dresses for, a lot of big celebrities like Dua Lipa type artists, right? So he did some stuff for The Weeknd and a lot of costume couture style design work lately. But at the time, he was a ready-to-wear designer that was selling into Nordstrom and Neiman Marcus and large retailers, right? And so I had an opportunity to come in and essentially take over the company. So I made an investment, literally put my life savings into it,
wow.
and ran the company. And it was a traditional style business, and I had an affinity and interest in fashion for a while, and then I found myself like kind of missing the digital tech kind of program that I was in before. And I was like thinking, okay, well, maybe we should start thinking about, e-commerce, or, how can we leverage technology to get, Louis Vuitton big. And I started, connecting with different, like at the time, like these were like early fashion blogger types, and trying to get some promotion and visibility for him. But it was still a very traditional style business at the time. But I during that time, I was trying to fundraise, and I came across a company that was pretty early in mobile commerce. And this company, I got very interested and excited about it. And the CEO and founder was like, holy shit, you have like this huge background in media and entertainment and now in fashion. And he's like, dude, I really could use someone like you. Like, I will give you co-founder status and bake you in with a boatload of equity. Because as much as I'd like to invest in your fashion company, like I'd rather invest in you coming over here.
Wow.
And I just kind of saw this kind of like flash where I was like, it was like that 2005 moment with YouTube all over. I was like, man, this is it. Because the fashion venture, I started doing some math and I was like, this is going to be tough, right? And I enjoy it. It's rewarding, but it's not going to be as lucrative as I had hoped or thought. And then I saw this emerging tech kind of program, and I was like, this could be it. And so I basically said, I'm open to it, but I need to do both. Like, I need to still serve this designer, and then I'll serve you. And slowly but surely, I started like, spending less time with the designer and more time with this tech entrepreneur. And it was nice because for the first time in a very, very long time, it was I was back in the game, and or it wasn't that long at the time, but I was back in the game, and it felt right. I was like, I'm back where I belong. This feels good. And then I actually brought this deal to UMG, and I brought it to like a bunch of industry friends that would be in a position to enable this technology. And what we found was, and this is where I really started to appreciate, product management, product design, product strategy, because it didn't have product market fit, right? There was desire for it, but the market wasn't ready for it, because, feature phones were still, believe it or not, used. People still had flip phones. They
Sure.
were still not quite adopting iPhones just yet, right? Blackberries were still very much in play. And so it just, the idea to buy, over your mobile phone, it just wasn't quite there yet, right? But it was happening. It just wasn't happening that fast. And then so, and this founder too, I also found the team to be so critical, because he and we found ourselves, very at extreme ends, like ethically and morally, I'd say. Like, his moral and ethical compass, and I won't name his name, but just very, like very willing to compromise and kind of playing that gray area, and his gray was very black and white to most people, right? And so I found myself struggling and just quite frankly very uncomfortable. And so I had another opportunity during that time pop up where I reconnected with some media exec friends. Actually, Sarah Jen, who I don't know where Sarah is these days, but she was at NFL and Fox for a while, and I think at the time she was at CBS. But she had hosted kind of like this LA kind of tech media mixer thing, and she used to do these like all the time. And basically every head of digital from every org, from Disney to, UMG to whatever, would show up at a bar and, do this happy hour and compare notes, right?
Sure.
And at one of these, I met Sarah's ex-boss, this guy named Adam Shaw. And Adam and we hit it off and we clicked, and Adam basically pitched me this idea to start a tech media venture capital group in LA. And he's like, hey, with your media tech background at UMG, my broadcast television and cable network background, at Fox, he was like the interim COO of the FX network. In fact, he helped stand up the FX network out of Fox. And then, so I was like, yeah, this seems like a no-brainer. Let's do it, right? And so I left the mobile tech, mobile commerce venture, and I joined Adam to start this tech media VC. And then also, I forgot, there was an in-between. So I spent also some time in the early days of influencer ventures. And so Michelle Phan, who at the time was the most subscribed female on YouTube, she started, and this is when multi-channel networks were the thing in LA.
Maker.
Yep, Maker Studios, full screen,
Yeah.
big frame, big screen, all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
And then so short story long on this was I connected with Michelle through my friend Chriselle Lim, who's to this day quite a force in the fashion, tech, media, digital space. And Chriselle and I met because she was a stylist. And so through my fashion kind of industry days, so not tech, not digital, it was through fashion, met Chriselle as a stylist. Chriselle, unbeknownst to me, was an up and coming, YouTube star and fashion blogger. But that's not what she wanted to do. She wanted to be in traditional fashion media. And so she was also the fashion editor at Gen Lux magazine. And so I started working with Chriselle to help her kind of, navigate this digital world and, figure out how to monetize it. And, kind of was sort of like a manager in a way, right? But I was kind of more of a partner. So I was like, hey, I'll partner with you in your business and kind of be your right hand to help you negotiate these deals and strategize and create product and whatever. And then she connected me to Michelle, who was one of her partners. And they had a multi-channel network called FAWN, FAWN, the For All Women Network, right? And
Nice.
and I joined, and I basically was,
You're the first man.
Yeah, I was the only straight dude actually in FAWN, because there were other dudes, but different, right? And so anyhow, so I was basically kind of like an interim COO, and I was kind of like Michelle's right hand at the time. And then so it was kind of helping them with securing their financing from Google, but also evaluating opportunities to secure venture capital outside. And I actually lined up a pretty large round with a friend of mine. I could probably share this now, but my buddy Tim Chang, who's at Mayfield, was quite excited about influencers at the time and social commerce. And he basically was like, hey, I think you're onto something really big here. I like where the multi-channel network kind of, market is kind of shaping and maturing. Maker was already very strong comp, full screen was a strong comp. And Fawn was ripe for to disrupt these kind of, behemoths at the time, right?
Sure.
And then so Tim was prepared and coaching me on how we can rally up some funding, and he would lead it, and he would pull on some other VCs to co-invest, and he could basically get us up to Maker in no time, right? And then Michelle and her manager at the time kind of had a difference of opinions, and they decided to kind of just stick with the creator fund that came from Google and just play it out, and not go through the kind of VC hyper growth blitz scale kind of approach and play. Because also they were it was early days of Ipsy as well, which at the time was called MyGlam. And so it was just there was a lot going on for them. So, nothing against the decision at the time. It was, I understand, right? But so that deal kind of, slipped. And then that's also when the opportunity with Adam came up to just do, because also that's where I started to learn a little bit more about how venture capital worked, and I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. Like, actually, I would love to back an entrepreneur, help them grow with capital, but also my network. And so that's where, Adam and I partnered, and simultaneously I was continuing to work with Chriselle. So while Fawn kind of went in a different direction, Chriselle saw this big picture, and I was like, hey, maybe we can come up with a venture backable model, and we can go and secure capital from Tim. And so we started, still tracking down that path. And then, and I kind of got like really obsessed with this whole like creator, influencer sort of economy that was starting to brew. And I was also starting early days I reconnected with the Far East movement, which they were signed with Interscope when I met them. Actually, I met them even prior to that, but I started working with them when they were signed to Interscope. And we reconnected, and I learned that they were also kind of in this multi-channel network space where they created a collective called ISA, International Secret Agents, right? And it was Far East movement, Kev Jumba, who was one of the big influencers at the time, Ryan Higa, who actually, next to Michelle, I think,
He might have been bigger than her, but
yeah, he was bigger. He was definitely bigger. But basically, like early 2000s, late 90s, the biggest influencers, the most subscribed influencers were Asian American. It was Ryan Higa and Michelle Phan, right? And then, but what is it? The Far East Movement guys managed to pull together this crew, like this all-star crew of Asian American creators, and the Wong Fu guys were heavily involved as well. So, but it was like this collective sort of consortium, and I basically was like, hey, try the Fawn playbook again. And I kind of explained, how multi-channel networks could work. And I was like, hey, we can pull together our views and start selling some big ad deals. And, and they were like kind of into it, but they also at the time, a lot of creators were starting to get angry at maker studios and, some of the MCNs. And they were like, no, this MCN thing, it's got a really, really bad connotation and we cannot be connected or associated to it. And I was like, well, geez, I mean, it is what it is, it's a network, it's a multi-channel network, it's like, I guess we can spin the term and still kind of go and hunt for these deals. And so I was trying to pull together, venture capital for that as well. But at that time, it just got really crowded and the MCN space was crowded. Maker, I think
200 million.
Yeah, just got acquired by Disney, right?
And they spun out to Disney.
Yeah. And then so but anyhow, the signals were very mixed and, weak and strong. And, so anyhow, short story long is I was like, okay, I went to bat again, swung hard, but struck out. Right. But nonetheless, it was okay. Cause to this day, I still maintain close contact and friendships with all these guys, and they're fantastic. And I still, we still try to work together on, doing ventures together and whatnot. But this is where also I kind of revisited this idea of shoppable content, because now, mobile was really starting to pick up like crazy. Everyone had an iPhone now, and people were shopping on their phones. And I was like, there's something missing here. It's like people are consuming these YouTube videos and Instagram photos. And, a lot of people are asking, and I was working closely with Chriselle at the time. A lot of people are commenting, hey, what is that bag? Where do I get that? How, I want that, and I was like, man, the technology exists. We can, hotspot it and kind of create some link to it. And Commission Junction existed at the time. And so I was like, I want to build this. And I connected with some friends that were product designers and engineers. And we basically decided to take a swing at creating our own Instagram, but it was like a shoppable Instagram, right?
Nice.
And I was like, I'll get all these influencers on it, these beauty bloggers, these fashion influencers, and this will enable them to sell, what they're wearing to their fans. And what I believed was such a brilliant idea at the time. It really was. It just was too early. And this goes back to the product market fit piece, right? Yep. So
timing.
Yeah. So, but I was really fortunate where I was able to recruit in some incredible, exceptional talent. So my CTO, he could have gone off and been the CTO of just about anything he wanted, but he saw, the opportunity, and he liked me. And then from there we recruited other people, and it was really cool. We had like our little tribe, and it grew, and we bootstrapped it. We all lived together in the same house, and I used to cook, and 3 meals a day for these guys while they would code, and and do biz dev and try to fundraise. And during this time, I reconnected with an old friend of mine, who's my neighbor, and then we crossed the friend zone, and then we're expecting a baby.
Wow.
Yeah. And then so we're like, okay, well, babies and startups don't go very well together. So, I'm finding myself like preparing to bring a baby into the world, and and we're now newlyweds, and and we're like, what are we gonna do? And I was like, well, I guess I can go and look for a job, and then I asked one of my friends, Tim, from Mayfield. I was like, Tim, I don't know what to do. And he had just had a baby girl like a couple years prior, and he was like, yeah, man, I get it. You're in kind of a tough spot. You don't have revenue, your product is still pretty early, and to be honest, like, it's just a little too early for Mayfield still. But he was kind of still like, he was an active advisor, and he was really, really, really helpful. And Tim, if you're listening, I love you, and I thank you so much for everything you've done, because it just really helped tremendously and shaped so much. And so Tim actually made a couple introductions. One was to Poshmark, which is IPO'd now.
Sure.
And we had some similarities to Poshmark, and Mayfield was an investor in Poshmark. I think the lead investor in Poshmark. And the other was to a friend of his, a guy named Rick Marini. And Rick, he's a force in the Valley. So Rick was the founder CEO of Branch Out, which was an early kind of Web2 kind of company that was a pretty big component of Facebook. And then Rick exited that to Hearst. And Hearst had a whole suite of magazines like Elle Magazine. So Tim kind of thought, hey, maybe Elle Magazine would like what you have, or maybe Poshmark might like what you have. And so the conversation started advancing very fast, because they all love Tim and respect him. And then so as I'm having these potential acquisition M&A conversations, the Hearst guy basically says, hey, I'm actually leaving Hearst, but you should talk to my brother-in-law. He's part of the Boston Consulting Group, and they're kind of doing some similar things. I was like, what? The BCG? Like, no way, that's weird. And so I was like, all right, whatever, I'll take the meeting. And I thought I was doing him a favor. So I take a call with his brother-in-law, and his brother-in-law is sharing what BCG was in the process of standing up, which was his digital venture group. And I was like, holy shit, this is actually super cool. And then he shares with me that they have a client in the apparel space that is trying to do shoppable content. And what I explained to him was like very, very aligned with what they're trying to build. And then so we started having conversations, and they essentially acquired us. But it was more of an acqui-hire, like a talent acquisition, than a true like acquisition of like our IP and valuing it at a
Sure.
premium.
That's
like
the
that.
best solution you could have hoped for.
Yeah. And so it was kind of a bailout, because we're getting into some pretty gnarly debt. And then, so we got acquired, and we joined BCG. And then we stayed, not all of us, but 3 of us went over, 2 joined their engineering group. I joined kind of the general practice. I was the first and only entrepreneur in residence at BCG.
Wow.
And then, and I basically was like kind of the interim or acting CEO of a dozen corporate-backed ventures. And interestingly, almost all of them were outside of media, entertainment, and fashion. They were all like energy related, industrial goods, building materials, things that were quite far away from where I had any experience or expertise, right? And it was fantastic. I really enjoyed my time there. And then also had a second child while I was there. So I've got 2 kids, Mackenzie and Matthew, 5 and 7. And so, but that's also where I thought like, oh, maybe it's time to get back on the saddle and be a real entrepreneur instead of a corporate entrepreneur. And then my son was born. I was like, yep, maybe I need a minute longer to kind of just park myself there. Yeah. And then, but yeah, wow, this is not a short story long. It's a long story, very, very long story, right?
But it's really interesting. It's interesting to see the journey, because not a lot of people, one, you can read a resume and it's bullet points, right? But you're showing us the connective tissue between each and every little point. and some of the reasoning behind it and some of the stuff that wouldn't, you were ready to have a baby. That's something that's not going to be in your resume. And someone might go, well, how did you go from A to C? Oh, the baby part was in the middle. No wonder.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, the life journey part of it is super interesting. So how does all this bring you to Gallery Arc, right? Today you're running a company called Gallery Arc, and you're specializing, I think, in AR. And I know you have your specialties kind of like geolocating objects, but how'd you get there, and where do you see that going?
Yeah. So when I ultimately left BCG, it will be about a year and a half, almost 2 years soon. I decided, hey, I want to get back in the game, and I started advising a couple startups. One I'm still pretty active with. It's called Boomo. It's a co-working for parents venture, and they've really started to find some strong product market fit around just straight up childcare. And while I was doing that, I was also advising a augmented reality platform called Goopy. And then the founder of this company, Goopy, is a buddy of mine, Paco. And Paco and I met while I was at BCG. In fact, I was trying to hire Paco to do some AR work for some of my corporate clients. And Paco and I, when we reconnected, he was like, hey, what are you up to? Like, let's figure out ways to work together. And, I was like, yeah, maybe, you can do some AR stuff for Boomo, because we had this ed tech component, right? And then he was, and also I was starting to do some work in the NFT space. And so one of our, dear and late friends, Jin, he got me onto Clubhouse, and that's where I got, early exposure to the NFT boom, right? And me, Jin, my brother, and a few others, we set up this thing called NFT for Good, because there was this unfortunate rise in hate and hate crime and violence towards Asians. And so we raised some money for Stop AAPI Hate, selling NFTs of Asian American heroes, right? And that was successful, and that's where I really kind of got immersed into the whole NFT space and game. And then Paco was following that, and he was like, "Hey, that's pretty cool. Like, can I get into that somehow?" And then I was like, I actually very quickly realized and recognized some white space. I was like, wow, no one's doing augmented reality NFTs. Literally nobody. I was like Googling it. Nobody was doing it. I was like, all the NFTs at the time were all PFP projects, yep, and with the copy paste roadmaps, right? It's like here's all the things you'll get with this merch and all, and I was like, oh my God, they're
door
all,
number 2.
yeah. And I was like, it's all the same thing. And I was like, and none of these are real utility, right? And then I was like, wow, well, like AR is like that already. There's so much utility and value. Like you can experience it, like in front of you. And I had become obsessed with AR for a while. Actually, I first came across augmented reality like in the early 2000s, working at Universal, where it was using a web camera and QR code, and it was fascinating. And so I was like, look, Paco, I think we could probably thread in an NFT offering with your AR. And so I started to look into bringing in some blockchain talent into his venture. And then what we also saw was kind of this second wave of, altcoins and ICOs being very successful. And so I said, we might even be able to go around traditional venture capital. We could probably fund this through a community. And so we started looking into setting up a DAO. Literally was like this close to getting a British Virgin Islands entity set up to get this DAO created and to do an ICO. And and then as I was doing all of this, Paco was kind of like, well, maybe we should just set up a new entity. Right. And I was like, okay, well, why don't we do that? So I will, and it wasn't my plan. I was like, I'll kind of interim CEO this thing, because I still kind of thought I would play this advisor kind of coach role. But I found myself dusting off the jersey and putting it on as the CEO. And then we stood up Gallery Arc as this augmented reality NFT Web3 venture. And then we were, kind of just getting ready to get an ICO together and put a white paper together. And then we're kind of in stealth mode. And then literally right around May, we're like, okay, let's go take this thing out, but let's actually go and take this to traditional institutional investors. So we lined up some meetings with some top tier venture funds, and this is late May. And then literally the conversations were fantastic. We were welcomed with open arms, and the conversations were accelerating very fast. And then boom, crypto winter happened again, and this is early June. And, basically everyone was like, oh yeah, in triage mode, we're not investing in anything. And we went to NFT NYC in June, and that was going to be sort of our coming out. And that's like when we came out of stealth. And then, man, I mean, it was grim. Like people there, they were still like partying, like as if it was still going, but the market it tanked, right?
Sure.
And that's when we're like, shit, we need to go back to the drawing board. And so we started to really rethink how we were going to position ourselves in the market. And what we decided was we would tone down the NFT language a bit, but double down on blockchain, because we had some really strong, robust blockchain capability and talent. And so we went back out and stood ourselves up as more of a general Web3 venture versus an NFT venture. And then we also found ourselves kind of really complementing a growing metaverse narrative that was really starting to brew, right? And because despite the NFT crash, there was like a growing metaverse kind of narrative that corporates were becoming increasingly attracted to, but the narrative was bogus, right? And we had always had this idea of converging, the real world with the meta world, or what we like to say, universe meet the metaverse, right? And it's the metaverse, not it's not, a universe, it's not universes, it's the universe, right? So it's universe meet the metaverse, not metaverses or a metaverse, it's the metaverse, right?
Yep.
And this is where we became obsessed with actually, converging these two pieces, bridging the gap from Web 2 to Web 3. And we felt that AR was the perfect medium, right? Because it's digital, but it's also strangely physical because it's in the physical world, right?
Yep.
And so we're seeing these digital kind of things, and this is actually kind of like I believe it's more URL to IRL than anything else, right? Because you're not leaving your room, you're not having to put, some headset and disappear and go into some simulation, right? You're still sitting in your chair and you're seeing this, this augmented reality shape and form in front of you, right?
It's enhanced.
Yeah.
Right. You're enhancing your capabilities and vision and potentially information in the same space that you'd normally be.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so this is where, we're still, firm believers in this. And we started to see how, AR can enhance, our environments, whether it's like, it's collecting cars, or it could be, artwork. We started in art, but then we quickly found ourselves in, industries like automotive and real estate as an area and sector that we're quite keen on and interested in. And so, the idea of having a digital twin of your most beloved asset, which for most people is their home or maybe their car, right? So suddenly you can put your house into Decentraland or into Sandbox or into Fortnite or into wherever, right? And this is where the blockchain it becomes very incredible, because it basically creates this ownership model and this ability to kind of show provenance and authenticity, right? What's still difficult to crack, and back to the metaverse, it's like the metaverse requires interoperability, right? Because what you see in Sandbox, what you see in Roblox is obviously going to look very different.
All
right?
different still, yes.
And so this is where it's important for the community to work together to kind of really create these interoperable pipes. And this is where blockchain can really help shepherd that, because it's giving people credit and recognition for a lot of these enhancements or interoperability blocks coming together, right?
I think you've hit on something. I mean, it's the same ledger, right? So if you've got let's just say a common chain, and I don't know if there is such a thing, although there's, I would say, a handful of chains that people are building on specifically, right? So if you can hone those down to one or two or three, and those become interoperable, all of a sudden everything that's sorted through that digital ledger system. And I think most blockchains operate pretty similarly, even though they're distinct chains. The information, the way it's sorted and stored and disseminated is very, very similar. So
Right.
I think those standards could be put in place. I do think you're right. It's completely necessary. I was having this conversation with Deanna from Diverge and some of the DressX girls, and it was like, if you can't wear what you bought in Decentraland in Upland or in the Sandbox or in Roblox, why would you buy it? Right? It's like
Yeah.
saying you can only wear this shirt in a green room on Thursday. Okay,
Yeah, no,
I'm
exactly.
not going to buy the shirt, right? I need to be able to wear it everywhere. So I think that's going to be a limiting factor for a minute, but I think people are trying to resolve that. Obviously, resolution, and we talk about Unreal versus Decentraland and the centralized projects versus decentralized projects where the money's been spent on the gaming platforms where the engines are very robust. There's a lot of people there. They're gamers, but they're also, the brands are kind of sucking them over. And then on the decentralized side with Sandbox and Decentraland, not really gaming platforms, but they are becoming more gamified as well to kind of meet in the middle somewhere. So the question is going to be, where do you put your things? How do you store them so they're applicable across the board?
Right.
How do people work? And I do think you're going to see specialization, because I was talking to, was it last from somebody, but they said we're building, oh, I guess it was Mark from my last week's podcast, Crystal City, their project in Decentraland, and they're going to specialize in, a certain type of brand or a certain type of consumer. And if you want to go somewhere else, you're going to look for, a sporting area or an entertainment area or a fashion area. I don't know that you can have all those in the same place at the same time. So maybe you'll see a more diverse smattering of development out there. But it's like you said, early days, and no one quite knows you. I'm just excited to see what you guys are doing, because you showed me a demo, I think at Expoverse LA or whatever, where it was a motorcycle that
Yeah.
I could look at. I mean, and sat right in front of me. You could almost get on it, right? And
Yeah.
that was super interesting. You conjured it up it took you like 5 seconds.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
that's where
No,
you
we
guys are
have.
going, super exciting.
Yeah, no, totally. Well, look, Steve, I'm stoked that we're in this together, and it takes a village, right? Like, we can't do this in silos, and this is where I'm really thankful to you and the Futureworlds team to bring everyone together, because it's going to take that lift. We can't. It's like we're trying to move a mountain, and doing it alone is impossible, but doing it together is possible, right? And you guys are basically like cross-pollinating and coordinating these efforts, and the sooner that we can align on the big picture and that mountain target, the sooner we can all lean in and move it together.
100%. And thank you for that. No, but the whole idea is build a community, right? And
Yeah.
let's do Web3 better than Web2, because Web2 got siloed out. People had different interests, and you've seen it's gone down to 5 companies really. So this is a chance for everybody to be involved, build it the right way, have some transparency, build in some equity and some ownership. This idea of decentralized ownership, consumer creators, where that line gets blurred. All that's super exciting. I know you got the hot, Elijah, but I appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for taking the time to jump on, and we will be in touch very shortly.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, this part of our conversation, I felt like should have been the whole part, but it was fun to go down memory lane with you earlier. So really appreciate
100%.
you. All right.
All right, we'll talk to you soon. Thanks, Elijah.
Yep, bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.